guys in the dark.
This is an update to a story that I had posted on a forum about 4 years ago. What happened was a direct result of me posting it. I've taken it down long ago, but I do need to share what has happened to me. You'll find out what happened in the first story as I tell this one. So a little bit about myself. I'm 43 years old, working as a salesman at a retail outlet that deals in men's business suits. The job makes really good money, but I seem to barely get by with my wife taking alimony and child support from me. I had just gone through the horror of divorce about 6 months before the last incident had occurred. I had fallen off the bandwagon and started drinking again. Drinking led to me longingly looking at sleeping pill bottles and razor blades once again. Never did it, but it all seemed very tempting, especially after losing everything like I did. I felt low for a few weeks. It was quite unpleasant, and it was a surprise when this elegant, very beautiful woman, about the same age as me, had came into the store and showed some kind of interest in me. She was tall, pretty slim, wearing a jacket and a shirt combo. Her hair was dyed a bronze amber, and she had a very unassuming smile. I'll admit that I had noticed her right before she even approached me. I had noticed her the moment that she had entered through the door. She seemed familiar to me, but I wasn't going to say anything to her about that. That's got to be the most obvious, non-pickup line in the world. Telling a strange woman that she looks very familiar. She had walked up to me with this smile, just barely showing a little bit of her perfectly white teeth, and said, "You probably think that I'm in the wrong store, don't you?" I gave her a little giggle. I cleared my throat and said, "I'm sorry?" "This is a man's store, obviously," she said. Her eyes were very deep brown, almost black, and they were lively, active, and just looking directly at me. "Well, ma'am," I had told her, "we do have suits and some jackets for ladies, if you'd like me to show them to you." "Ma'am," she remarked playfully, "do I really look like I'm that old to you?" I chuckled a little nervously, breaking eye contact and clearing my throat once again. I must have seemed like a schoolboy to her. I then told her, not at all, that she didn't look that old, but that I just wanted to be very respectful to her. Her smile then widened. Her long purple fingernails started fidgeting with her purse strap. "Well," she said in a soft, heavy voice, "I'm just here to find a suit for my son. He wants to get a tuxedo for prom." I raised my brow. This was the dead of winter. Proms aren't usually held until June, maybe late May at the earliest. "I know," she said, reading the look on my face. "His school is impossible. They want to hold it early so that the students don't have to get too distracted from their studies. My son also was too busy playing computer games to get a suit himself, and too embarrassed to come with me, so I'm here for him." I couldn't help but grin. Just my luck, I thought. I showed her some of our popular items. She told me her son's size, the measurements. Together we had found something that she thought that he would like. The whole time she sided close to me. I could smell her perfume. It was very soothing, and I'll admit, I didn't make any attempt to distance myself from her at all. As I was ringing her up at the cash, I told her that if anything didn't fit, she could always bring it back in, and we would just adjust it to fit her son. She gave a low, almost inaudible laugh, told me that I probably didn't have to worry about any of that. There wasn't any other customers in the store then, and the cashier was on break. We continued to chat up a little bit. She asked me what I did in my spare time for fun. I had hesitated, thinking of the rows of empty liquor bottles that were in my apartment, all the sleeping pills next to the bathtub. Instead of answering that question, I jumped at the opportunity, and then I asked if she'd like to get a drink later, that evening. She just tilted her head and scanned me with her very sexy, roaming eyes. "When do you get off work?" she asked softly. "At 7 o'clock. The words leapt from my mouth. "If that's not too late for you, that is." "No," she said, her grin flashing at me over supple red lips. "That's perfect. I know a bar that's right around the corner of the area. I'll be out front to pick you up." "Great," I said. "What's your name again?" "Andrea." "My name is Andrew. Nice to meet you." "Naturally," she said. That seemed to put my nagging feeling of deja vu to rest. I'd never known an Andrea, or met any Andreas for that matter, but the name was fitting, and I rolled each syllable over and over across my tongue as much as I could, waiting for the hours of my shift to just go away. At around 6:30, we were locking up. The girl that I was working with was balancing the cash register, while I had written out the day's records in the books. As I wrote down the total debit and credits, I could barely hold on to the pencil. I was very jittery. It's pathetic, I know. It must sound like that, but it's been a while since I had been with a woman in any way. Being older and divorced, it was hard to build up the confidence to start dating once again. At 7 o'clock, it was dark outside. She had walked out and said goodbye as I locked up the front door. At the curb in the front of the sidewalk was a small blue station wagon. It wasn't very fancy, but I wasn't going to complain about it. I looked through the passenger side window and saw Andrea peering out at me. Her eyes were meeting mine, that smile drawn across her face. I had gotten in and immediately noticed how cold it was in there. There didn't seem to be any heating on at all. The radio wasn't even playing. Strange, I thought, but maybe she just lives close by. As she headed out of the plaza and onto the main road, I had talked about the tuxedo that I had sold her and how most customers were very happy with it. She didn't respond at all. Wasn't smiling anymore. I didn't think too deep into it, though. After all, she was driving. It's important to keep concentration on the road. The only thing that struck me as odd was that she had placed her purse on her lap while she was driving, since I had to sell my car after the divorce. I was just happy not to have to ride the bus. So as I eased back up in my seat and enjoyed, I think that's the reason that I didn't notice that we had been on the road a very long time, even though her telling me that the bar was close by. I had known something was up after she had gotten onto the highway. I had looked at her confused. Didn't you say that the bar was right out of town? She didn't respond to me. Her eyes were glued onto the road as we cruised up the ramp and onto the interstate. By now I was getting pretty nervous. I noticed that she took her left hand from the steering wheel and then reached inside of her purse. "You don't remember me, do you?" she said. Her voice was now louder than the car engine. I had giggled a little bit, but I didn't find this funny at all. "I really don't remember," I said, looking at her. "You do look familiar, but I know that I've never met an Andrea before." I looked down at her lap, onto her now open purse. I felt my heart stop in my chest. Inside the tapped handle held in her delicate fingers as a snub-nosed revolver. I squirmed in my seat, as if I was going to fly right out of the window. The seatbelt was digging into my neck now. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted between the panting breaths. The gun was now out, and it was pointed directly at me. "You don't know any Andrea, but you might remember Alicia." Probably from the panic that I felt staring down the barrel of the gun, the name didn't ring any bells. She looked directly at me, those bedroom eyes now burning like hot coals. "Open up the glove box," she muttered in a staid voice. "What?" I had asked her. "Open up the glove box," she screamed. I had shuddered from the sharp change in her voice. As I did as I was told, I stretched my shaking hand, pushed the lock open. The compartment door had fallen open, and out spilled what had to be hundreds of pages of papers. They were all lying at my feet. She peered at me with a quick glance, told me to read the stapled pages printed on red paper. I picked them up and recognized what it was. It was the post of my stalker story that was on the internet forum. I then knew who she was immediately. The mentally disturbed girl who happened to stalk me at my workplace and at my home many years ago when I was in my late teens. I had pleaded with her, and she hollered at me to just read it, her eyes back on the road, but the revolver was now trained on me. I did as she said. It happened to all be there. My words exactly. How she had come into that coffee shop where I happened to work. How her hair was constantly tangled and greasy. How her clothing was always in tatters, and how she always smelled of body odor and Vaseline. It happened to all be there. How she had come in every single morning. How she knew my schedule, and when my shift had started. How my coworkers had told me that she would sometimes come in on my days off, and ask where I was at the time. How one night I had found her waiting for me at my house. I tried swallowing, but I couldn't. I was trembling at the printed out pages that fell from my weak hands. She peered over at me. I could see her from the corner of my eye, and told me to pick up the next set of papers, the one printed on gray paper. I begged her again to just let me go, but she screamed me to read it out loud. I had picked them up, not recognizing any of the writing on it. Then I realized that these were comments that people had written on my post of that story, all about how much of a crazy bitch she was, or how I should have just hit her. I started to involuntarily cry. She had found that story. She knew what it was, and had come for me. I was choked up, having to read all of those comments, and realized her purpose. I really didn't know it would upset you this much. I never used your real name, though. Do you think that even matters? Her voice had cracked. It was like an animal growling directly at me. All sophistication and sensuality had gone. I knew that story was about me, about a time in my life that I was ashamed of. It sounded as though she had begun to sob. I looked directly at her, and her mouth was hung open, as if it was a silent scream. Her eyes were squinted closed. Yes, she was crying. After a few moments, she gave a cough, tossed back her hair, and was once again icily composed. I looked close, and could just see smudges of her mascara under her eyes. She told me to reach inside of her purse. I, of course, wasn't about to do that. I won't shoot you if you do exactly as I say, she said, and she said it as calmly, but unevenly as possible. The voice had smacked out of psychotic desperation of the girl who had pestered me those many years ago. I had nodded my head slightly, then quickly turned to glance out the window. It was now dark, and there were few cars on the road. I was careful not to brush up against the gun. I reached over and put my hand in her purse. Inside I had felt that, like a set of Polaroids. My skin was cold, imagining that these were probably photos of me that she had taken without any of my knowledge. I had pulled them out. They weren't of me at all. The first was a couple standing outside of a wedding chapel. The woman was smiling in a white lace gown. The handsome, mustached man next to her was wearing a black tuxedo. They were close together and holding each other's hands. I had flipped to the next photo to see the same couple kissing each other with their eyes closed, sun setting about a glimmering ocean right behind them. I flipped through, and in the next photograph, I saw a woman lying in a hospital bed, covered by dark green surgical sheets, holding a newborn baby. The child was wrapped up in a blanket. The husband was standing right beside them, smiling. I flipped through, saw a photo of a couple with two preteen children, sitting on a beach, wearing jean shorts and bright-colored shirts, smiling up into the camera's point of view. I all of a sudden realized that these photos were of her. She happened to have a family, or she had one. But what did this even have to do with me? I really don't understand, I mumbled to her. She shot me a look out of the corner of her eye, but didn't say anything. I looked out the window and saw that there was no lights on the side of the road. Past the shoulder there was nothing but tall trees and bleak wilderness. We were now far from any city or town. I thought about reaching in my coat for my phone, but I knew that if I did, she would have shot me. I then started wondering why she just didn't kill me already, if that's what she intended to do. The moments had felt like hours in that car. Darkness beside the roadside seemed to stretch for an eternity, like I had woken up in hell. Finally, after God knows how long, she had spoken up. It took me 10 years, she had said. Her voice was now straining, like that demented girl that I remembered. It took me 3 years to get over you, and then another 7 just to forgive myself. I had gone to counseling, some therapy. Eventually I agreed to take the medication. You see, I suffer from schizophrenia, and it sort of runs in my family, but it didn't appear to me until about 5 months before I had even met you. My parents got a divorce. My doctor had told me that's what's likely triggered my breakdown. Then when I saw you, it was like you were just there for me. My psychiatrists say that I was using you as a misplaced source of love and security, which I had been torn away from my parents. You were always there, and always so polite, so I mistook your politeness and charm for love and affection. At that moment, I didn't know why I didn't feel scared anymore. It felt really gloomy, depressed. We often called people crazy, but when we actually hear the medical terms, that it becomes a lot less distant and a lot more real. 10 years after you, I had avoided people. I didn't see friends. I barely spoke to my parents, and I never went out on dates. First because I was still in love with you, and then because I was so ashamed. Ashamed and afraid that I would become that super attached psycho that I had been with you. I mentioned so many times to contact you and to apologize, but my counselor and my doctor were very adamant that that would be an absolute bad idea. They said that it would cause me to possibly relapse. So for 10 years I was alone, hating myself for everything. Then I had met David. David was a graduate student in university. He approached me first. We happened to meet at a bar or a restaurant. I don't really remember. My parents insisted on taking me out for my birthday, and he'd asked the waiter to put our bill on his tab. She then gave a laugh. A tear trembled down her cheek. He barely had enough money to pay for his beer, and he wanted to pay for a whole family's meal just to speak with me. A year or so into our marriage, we had 2 children. We were both very happy. I was very happy. I had got a job as a typist at a law firm. It wasn't much, but it had given me something to do after the children were old enough to go to school. I did like working there. Everyone was friendly and helpful. One day, Mark, one of the law firm's support staff members in the facility, was showing me this website that he often goes to, mostly to look up funny pictures. Told me about this page that happened to have a lot of true stories on it. I searched the posts, and it didn't take me very long to find one that was very familiar. I knew that it was you that happened to post it. She then stopped, let out a heavy sigh. Her eyes were rolled up and looking long at the car roof. It was as if though she could not believe that she was telling me this. Her voice had stopped sounding like a nervous psychotic, and more like that of a sobbing, distraught woman. The gloom had lingered thick inside of the car, over both of us. My paranoia and anxiety had spiked. She continued on. I tried to fight it by upping the dose of my medication. That didn't work at all. Pretty soon I just stopped, since they only seemed to make me drowsy. She gave another humorless little laugh as though she had caught herself in a lie. I thought it was because David had seen the post that he had left me, and why I couldn't even get joint custody of the children. But that's not true at all. The truth is, seeing your post had made me act erratic. I started throwing fits, fighting with him for absolutely no reason, shouting at my children, beating them over things that weren't even their fault. I stopped sleeping at night, believing that the next-door neighbors were spying on us and plotting to come in and steal everything that we owned. It was because of me that he left, and I acted that way because of your post. I was now staring out the window. I could just make out open fields in the distance with the slightest smattering of the brush. Where the hell was she taking me? I just couldn't forgive myself. I know now that I never will. I gulped and I asked, "How did you even find me?" She smiled in my direction, amused by my discomfort. One of the criminal lawyers at my firm has a team of private investigators, if you will. I do paperwork for them often, so I forged a memo asking one of the PIs to find your whereabouts. It didn't take them very long. I knew what your full name was, where you had once worked, and where you happened to grow up. I, of course, was surprised that you still lived there after all of those years. She now had a spiteful smile, and mocking me. That and her last comment made me look away. Of course, when Mike had found out about it, I was fired. They called it misappropriation of the firm's sources. It didn't help that I was already on thin ice, for obvious reasons, The road that we had driven on was disintegrated into a rough patch of concrete. It was as though we had gone back in time to when it was nothing but dirt and jungle. I started worrying that if we drove any longer, that the road would just stop, or we would be stranded in desert. Regardless, we had driven on, the car swaying and lurching over the craggy pavement. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It said 12:03. We had been driving for hours. Another hour passed with nothing, just silence. I was absorbing everything that she had told me. I felt this weight form in the pit of my stomach. I caused all of this. I ruined her life. And for what? A little bit of attention on an online forum. The episode hadn't been that much of my life. And for God's sakes, she was schizophrenic. The whole damn time, things seemed sleazy, and I no longer felt scared. I wasn't frightened at all. I just wanted all of this to end. By 1:15, she had slowed down. We pulled over, parked on the gravel shoulder by a vast, empty field. The car was sitting right next to the road. She killed the engine. Her headlights had died as well, and it all went black beyond the windshield. My eyes had adjusted, and I could just make out the black shape of the field right beneath the lighter shade of the starless night sky. We both had sat there, not looking at each other at all, like we had just fucked each other for money. She didn't move at all. The revolver was still trained on me. "I'm sorry," I said. "I know that what I did was very wrong. When I met you, it was at a moment when you were most vulnerable, and it was wrong for me to take advantage of you, even years later." She didn't look at me, didn't move, but I knew that she had heard me. "Go ahead," I said. "Kill me. I deserve to be hurt. I deserve to die. I don't want to live anymore anyways." Just then she straightened in her seat, still staring right out the field before us. "No," she said. "You deserve to feel what I feel every single day." Then I heard the hammer click backwards and watched as she opened up her mouth and stuck the barrel right inside. I shouted and lunged, but there was a flash. I saw spots. My ears were ringing and blocked like I was underwater. After about a minute, my eyes had finally adjusted. I was then surprised by the woman's mutilated face resting right next to me in the car. The interior had splattered with all of her blood. My hand groped endlessly for the door handle. Finally, I found it. I fell out onto the pebbled ground from the passenger side. I got on my hands and my knees, puked. After I stood up, I doubled over and dry heaved for many minutes. From there, I'd walk to the shoulder, not thumbing, not trying to get home, just trying to get as far away from there as possible. Eventually, by daybreak, everyone driving a rusted pickup pulled over and asked if I needed a lift. I was still shaken and exhausted. I approached his passenger side window. Once I was a foot away from his truck, I saw his face, drained pale. His pupils shrank in his sockets, and in one hyper movement, he grabbed the gear stick and put it into drive and then sped away. I stared at the vehicle confused. I looked down at my clothing. I was, of course, covered with blood. I took off the jacket and shirt, wiped down my face, and then tossed them. Continued in just my undershirt and my slacks. About 2 hours later, someone finally picked me up, drove me as far as the next major city. From there I took a bus home and called in to work sick. A week after the incident, 2 officers had come to my house. They asked me about my relationship to the deceased. I had told them the whole story. They informed me that I had found Google Map printouts of my address and a PI file of my name at the scene. They tried to get me to downtown with them, but I had refused and called my lawyer, a new one at that, who agreed to represent me without any costs. Told me that there's no chance of a charge of murder being brought against me. The evidence of possible foul play is a pretty thin thing. My story, although incredible, makes enough sense. The police are happy to write off her death as a suicide, rather than spend many hours and OT investigating a homicide. I was recommended to a better matrimonial lawyer, and I got my alimony reduced, received more time to see my children. Also entered AA, where I have started to get over my self-destructive thoughts and my behavior. Don't get me wrong, I do feel horrible about everything that has happened, and her last words do stick with me. But I mean, how far does guilt really get you? My stalker and I had common friends, and that is how I had met him. We became friends, and we would often call, text, or land up in the same place as I was. After some time, he had asked me out. I said no since I was moving out of town for further studies. Also, I wasn't interested in him. He had flown into a rage and began calling me names, saying that I had led him on, which I really hadn't. After I moved to another city, he got a hold of my number, began calling and texting, threatening stuff. He came to my city and began following me around, texting me where he would see me at and what time. He began calling friends, especially women, and saying disgusting stuff to them. He would call all night long. I once woke up to 58 missed calls. I told my parents because I didn't want to worry them. My father was a serious health issue, and stress as a trigger. But eventually, I had to when it started getting too worse. I had broken down when he threatened to hurt my sibling, and I finally told my parents about this. My father immediately called him up, threatened to take him to the cops, and ensure that he was behind bars for the rest of his life. That scared him, I think. He began backing off, and eventually stopped. For years after that, he still stalked me online, mailed me, and even tried contacting me through social media. But I had blocked him and never responded. The only good thing out of this was when I found my true friends, who were there, who stood through thick and thin, often dropping me to my hotel after college. So I was never alone, and of course, my family's protection and love. Being a man, I never thought that I would have a problem with stalkers, but I was proven wrong. In college, there was a girl who used to take a lot of interest in me. As any 19-year-old college goer, I would often bunk lectures to hang out with my friends. This girl would then walk up to me, act all concerned about my attendance and my studies, which was frankly none of her business anyways. She soon started stalking me on social media, asking me how my day went, stuff like that. This went on for a little while, and one day she turned up outside a cyber cafe where my friends and I were gaming and demanded that I gave her my phone number. She soon followed me like a shadow to every place that I went to. When I couldn't take it anymore, I walked up to her, told her to quit stalking me. After that confrontation, she was somewhat slighted and stopped disturbing me.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.